Welcome to our continuing YouTube video series on employment law. My name is Christopher Neufeld of Neufeld Legal, and in this particular YouTube video, we're going to be discussing the concept of termination pay. Now, first of all, termination pay is a construct of statute as opposed to common law, which is where severance pay lies. So, given that it is a construct of statute, it is particular to the jurisdiction within which one is being terminated from their employment. What that means is that there is an underlying employment law, a statute or an act, that will dictate the terms of termination, being termination notice and termination pay. And you have to be looking at that specific statute for your province or state in which you are working to determine what the applicable rules are and to identify what laws might apply in the interpretation of that rule and those laws that are set out in the statute. So one state or province will differ from another state or province. And you have to look at the specific law, the specific statute, to ascertain what the obligations on the employee and the employer are with respect to termination, termination notice, and termination pay. So let's talk about what some of the basic rules can be. And some of the basic rules that we find with respect to terminations and termination pay relate to the fact that each of the employees and the employers must give the other notice of the intention to end the employment relationship. So when one of the employer or the employer determines that they want to be ending the employment relationship, they need to give appropriate notice. And that notice is found in the statute. Now, oftentimes from the employer's perspective, if they want to terminate or exit out a particular employee, they do not wish to give them notice and have them continue on the job, continue to get paid for a set period of time as required by the governing statute, but instead they would like to see them exit immediately, whether it's because they don't anticipate quality work going forward, they see problems, they don't think it's entirely right to have a person who needs to start looking for new employment still on the books and working for them, potentially causing difficulties, problems, stealing. Oftentimes, simply they just want to cut their ties with that individual and see them off and on their way. As such, instead of giving termination notice, what they will look to do is provide them with termination pay or termination pay in lieu of notice. That's the more full contract. There's also the ability to have a combination of two. However, typically what most employers do and what most employment situations have is a termination pay arrangement that they have with their exiting employee. They say, made the determination, this is what we're going to take care of you with respect to your termination pay in lieu of notice. And just so you know, we're not going to be discussing severance pay in this video, as you can pretty much tell. So what do you need to do then? From the employer's perspective and also from the employee's perspective, what they need to do is look at the governing law, the governing statute. And what they typically find is something along the lines of where the employer is not going to provide the employee with termination notice, they need to pay as termination pay in lieu of notice what would be at least the equivalent of the wages that that particular employee would have attained had he been provided with the requisite notice, working regular hours. So that is the typical standard that one is looking at, and one needs to look at the governing statute and applicable case laws to properly interpret that. There's also the issue of where an employee has sort of a sporadic or irregular or inconsistent or even slight inconsistency with respect to how their wages have been paid over the last period of time. What is the construct or what is the formula for ascertaining what that payment is? So, for example, let us say in the particular jurisdiction that one is residing in, it says that if an employee, in the legislation says, if an employee has been working for 8 or more years, but less than 10 years, they will be entitled to 6 weeks of notice. So based on that, you look at what the calculation is for 6 weeks of notice. You might have a pay statement that has a consistent pattern of what 6 weeks of pay would be, or what a week of pay would be. And if it is consistent week after week for the last several months, that will be the basis that one will be utilizing. If there is that inconsistency there, then one would need to look further into the legislation and one might have a formula. For example, you might use the average of the last 13 weeks during which the employee was employed with the employer. You take the average of their regular pay, and that amount is payable once you take that average and you multiply it by the requisite notice time, giving you 6 times that weekly amount, and that would be your termination pay in lieu of notice. Naturally, you have to understand the full scope of the statute, not simply those specific 2 provisions that we're focusing on, but the whole of the statute, as well as the relevant case law, the legal precedent for interpreting that statute. And that needs to be calculated into the whole formula. That is what is driving you with respect to termination pay in lieu of notice. It is very much statute driven, very clear, very formulaic, and as such, quite different from the approach one needs to take with respect to severance pay, which is, as we mentioned, not something we're going to discuss here, but something that is pertaining to calculations, a methodology that is driven by case law, precedent, and aspects that are not tied to a specific statute, but to practices that are very argumentative and factors that are weighed by the various parties in such a manner that typically employers weigh certain factors higher and less lower, and employees aim them higher. And it creates considerable consternation and conflict. That is not the case with termination pay. Termination pay is a very structured, very regiment, statute-driven, formulaic process that can be, upon appropriate reading of the whole of the statute and the core provisions, discernible, identifiable, and what is due to employees when the conditions are met for providing either termination notice or termination pay. I trust you found this YouTube video informative and has provided you with some insights into the concept of termination pay in lieu of notice. Thank you.